Hey everybody. This video is going to go over the PowerPoint What is Argument in the Week 1 module. So you're probably wondering, the title of the course is Rhetorical Persuasion. So what does that have to do with argument? And you're going to find out that they are basically one and the same. When we talk about rhetorical persuasion, we are talking about argument. So understanding argument is crucial to understanding everything that we're going to cover throughout the quarter. So after you click on the PowerPoint, after the title slide, slide 2 asks you, what are your thoughts? Starting off first week of the quarter, what comes to mind when you hear the word argument? It can probably end up being a lot of different things because argument has different connotations, and depending on your personal experience, you may have very specific associations with the word argument that might be completely different than what someone else associates with that word. So what are your thoughts? How would you define argument? Do you consider argument to be a part of your daily life? Why or why not? Do you think argument is a good thing or a bad thing? And then finally, it asks you, what would life be like? What would the world be like without argument? It's probably tempting to say that it would be fabulous, right? Everybody would stop arguing, stop bickering, stop fighting. The world would be a really happy, peaceful place. But that might not necessarily be the case, which we will find out. So slide 3 then says, consider this. Thinking about those questions, did your answers include any of the following? So when you think of the word argument and how to define it, was your answer something like argument attempts to resolve issues between two or more parties? Argument is rational disagreement, but it can get emotional. Arguments can result in agreement and compromise. Argument is angry people yelling at each other. I'm sure we all have that experience with argument. Argument is standing up for your ideas, defending them, and minimizing the opposition by being persuasive. And the world would be better if no one argued. Do you have any of those answers? Anything similar to any of those? I'm sure some of you did. But that last question on slide 2, what would the world be like? What would your life be like if there was no argument? So the right side of slide 3 here says, what if society or what if a government outlawed argument? And you have to think about what argument really entails. Argument is not just people being angry and yelling at each other. I think that in our culture, especially, we try to give different names to different situations. So when you are trying to decide where to go to dinner with your significant other or your kids or your friends, and everybody wants to go somewhere different, and you have to decide, you have to figure out where you're ultimately going to go, or you're having a discussion with the people that you live with, whether that's family or roommates or whoever. Who's responsible for doing the dishes, who's responsible for taking out the trash, things like that. We tend to give those things different names. We are having a disagreement. We're having a discussion. We're trying to figure it out. And the truth of the matter is, all of those scenarios involve argument, but we tend to think of argument as that really extreme, unhealthy disagreement. But it's not. We have attached that association to the word argument, but argument in and of itself is literally persuasion. So what if the government outlawed argument? Well, first, everyone would probably think the same, right? We wouldn't be able to have different opinions. We'd all have to watch the same shows. We'd all have to like the same movies. We'd all have to like the same music. We'd all have to eat the same things. It would be illegal to disagree on those matters. There would never be any progress. You would never be able to offer a different perspective. You'd never be able to say, hey, this isn't working. How about we try this instead? There would be no progress. There would be no new knowledge, right? Fields of study would never evolve, never progress, right? Advertising would become a thing of the past because we're going to learn throughout the quarter that advertising is entirely based on argument and persuasion. Opinion pieces like reviews, movie reviews, restaurant reviews, product reviews, they probably wouldn't exist because you can't offer your opinion if argument is outlawed. Life would be pretty boring without arguments. So if you have any of those associations with argument, and when you hear that word, you're like, oh, no, thank you. I don't have the time or the stamina to engage in argument, because when every argument I've ever been in, it's never ended well, and everybody gets all angry and feelings are hurt and words are said and bridges are burnt. That's not all argument is. Argument encompasses so much more. And that is what we are going to focus on this quarter, is all of those other aspects of argument that we're surrounded with on a daily basis and probably don't even realize it most of the time. So what is argument? All right, so slide 4, we start getting into some definitions of argument. And a very simple definition is that argument equals a claim plus support, right? You make a claim, you support that claim. That's an argument. Our textbook defines argument as the act of asserting, supporting, and defending claims, and it's an intellectual and social process. People are surrounded by argument. Voicing our opinion is a form of argument, and even American history can be seen as a series of arguments. We will actually look at the Declaration of Independence later this quarter. So that is our textbook's definition. You move on to slide 5, we get another one, actually 2 more. So there's some definitions that consider persuasion in how they define argument. Argument seeks to persuade and influence, right? If you are arguing with your roommates or friends or significant other about where to have dinner, you are ultimately trying to persuade and influence them to go where you want to go, right? And they're doing the same thing. There's some definitions that consider perspective. Argument is a discussion involving different points of view, kind of like a debate, right? And then there's this longer blended definition on the next slide. The goal of argument is to bring about a change in an audience's initial position on a controversial issue. It doesn't have to be controversial. Depending on the situation and audience, at times the goal is achieved when an arguer presents a claim along with reasons and evidence to convince an audience to agree with their position. That's what we call traditional or academic argument. At other times, arguers create a possibility of agreement. They're acknowledging different points of view. They're working to identify one view or a combination of views that are acceptable to most or all audience members. So compromise, right? Agreement. That's what we often call consensual or Rogerian argument. But don't forget about that very simple definition we started with. Argument equals claim plus support. That's it. Can it get emotional and heated and angry? Well, sure. But it can also be very simple, and it can be very benign. And we will see just how much argument is a part of our daily lives throughout the quarter. But I want to go back to part of that really long definition where we talked about traditional or academic argument, which is where, you have someone who's arguing for something. They're making a claim and they're supporting it, and their goal is to change the opinions of their audience. Academic argument. Because argument is not always standing up and like beating someone else, or winning the argument, or preaching to an audience. Usually argument involves making a debatable position seem reasonable or acceptable, right? I know you disagree with me initially on this issue. I'm going to present an argument and support that argument, and I'm going to make it, if I do my job well, I'm going to make my position seem totally reasonable and totally acceptable, and you're going to be more likely to see my point of view, right? So academic argument seeks to make others see the wisdom of a position or perspective. And advances in any field of study can only happen when the members of that field debate and argue ideas. Then we move forward, we have progress. And while people are entitled to their own opinions, holding too strongly to an opinion shuts down potential growth. If you hold too strongly to your opinions and shut out everything else, you don't even give it a chance, you don't even listen, then you're getting rid of the possibility for change and advancement and progress, right? So that's academic argument. So what about that traditional or classical argument? That was also something that was mentioned in that longer definition. So traditional or classical argument is founded in ancient Greek philosophy, or rhetoric. So thinking back, if you remember any of this from high school or other college classes, Aristotle, one of the most famous Greek philosophers, he made it clear in a lot of his writings that an arguer, the person who's making the claim, should use whatever means of persuasion available in order to convince an audience to agree. So think of courtroom argument, public debates, speeches, and one-on-one everyday argument. You're using whatever means of persuasion you have available to try to convince the other person or the other people to agree with you. And classical argument emphasizes several things. First of all, there are 3 types of claims. There's claims of fact, claims of value, and claims of policy. We will learn a lot more about all 3 of those throughout the quarter. There are 3 types of support, how you back up your argument. There's evidence, examples, and appeals. We're going to learn a lot about those as well. And then there's 3 types of appeals. There's ethos, which refers to character. There's pathos, which refers to emotions. And there's logos, which refers to logic, right? So that's the sort of foundation of traditional or classical argument. And that is what we're going to spend a good bit of time learning about throughout the quarter. Let's see, what's next? Oh yeah, the consensual or Rogerian argument. Unfortunately, we're not going to spend quite as much time on this as we are traditional argument, but it is also founded in ancient Greek philosophy. And Plato and Socrates, Aristotle came from that, but Plato and Socrates viewed argument as a way of seeking consensus, right? Or a dialectic. So, whereas traditional argument, you could think of courtroom debate, right? You have two attorneys, right? You have the prosecution and the defense, and they are both presenting evidence, examples, appeals to try to convince the jury. So, in that kind of sense, there is like who's going to win, right? Who's going to provide the best argument. But then there's the jury. Once it's all been presented, the jury then has to come to a consensus. So they are all presenting their claims when they're all debating, deliberating. They're all giving their opinions and their evidence, their support to try to convince the rest of the jurors to vote this way, right? So that's consensual. Academic inquiry. When we are reading journal articles and things like that, all of those authors are participating in a very long, very deep, rich argument. Everybody is chiming in, so to speak, right? Philosophical discussions are most definitely consensual and Rogerian. You're trying to come up with what works best for the majority. Negotiations and mediation, right? When you go into negotiations or mediation, like with a divorce or with custody or any other type of legal thing like that, the idea is that both sides are going to get to have their own input, and then there's going to be an agreement, some sort of consensus, right? Compromise. Even our internal argument, what we have going on in our heads every day, right? We're don't know where the voices are coming from, whose points of view, but we're weighing our options all the time, right? And we have to figure out, how to take all of those bits and pieces and come up with something that works for us, right? So Rogerian argument kind of comes from that. We'll discuss it a little bit in chapter 4, but from the psychologist Carl Rogers, and he was a psychologist, so he's dealing really with patients. So it's not even about philosophy or composition or rhetoric or anything like that. He's a psychologist. But obviously, if you're dealing with people in your office, maybe it's even couples therapy or family therapy, things like that. He came up with sort of a method for ensuring that a consensual argument happens. The road, the best path to success. And so one of the tenets of his philosophy is that you listen with understanding first. So I don't know who gets to decide who's going to present their side of things first, but if it's not you, then what you have to do is listen, truly listen. Because then the second step is you have to accurately restate the other person's position. Not just saying, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. You actually have to repeat it back until they're confident that you understood what they were trying to say. And then you respond with your input. And the idea is that if you take that time to truly listen, you take that time to put what they're saying in your own words and repeat it back to their satisfaction, you have paused, so to speak, and your emotions won't be quite on the surface as they were initially. So there's a better chance of a rational exchange and mutual understanding. I wish we could spend an entire quarter on that because I think it's useful for everybody, especially in the age of social media. Then we come into the next slide, which is another branch of argument called the Toulmin argument. Sorry, a little glitch there. So anyway, we're going to talk about the Toulmin model in chapter 5, but basically this is another philosopher and educator, Stephen Toulmin, who provides even more to think about in terms of argument. So his focus, though, is on our lines of reasoning in argument, our train of thought, the steps we take in our minds to create an argument and support it. He gives us tools to analyze an argument, as well as things to think about when we are creating our own arguments. Okay, we'll spend some time on that in chapter 5. So I want to talk a little bit too about when argument works best, because you will be asked to create an argument this quarter. That's what the whole course project focuses on. You're going to write an argumentative research paper. Persuasive, right? So you want to make sure that for argument to work, there has to be an issue that's worth arguing. You have to pick a topic that is relevant and that means something. There has to be an arguer, there has to be an audience, there has to be common ground. There has to be something that you have in common with your audience, even if it's just the tiniest little thing, something to create common ground, and then they're more likely to listen. There has to be a way for your argument to reach your audience. There has to be a forum, whether it's a speech, an essay, a podcast, or a speech, whatever. There has to be audience outcomes. There has to be a way that the argument is going to affect the audience. Those are when argument works best. Argument fails when there's no reason to argue, when there's no disagreement. You know, you don't want to argue something that the majority of people already accept. You have to do something different. It really doesn't work well either when you're using risky or trivial issues. Those can get much more difficult to successfully argue. Argument tends to fail when you can't create common ground. If you're up against an audience that is hostile or just so steadfast in their opinion, if you can't find a way to create common ground with them, they're not going to give you the time of day. So you have to try really hard sometimes to find the common ground. But once you do, that's like the door cracking open a little bit, just enough for you to start to go through, if you will. And obviously, if you're ending in fights and negative outcomes, argument has failed. So we're going to be creating arguments. You're going to be writing this course project, this essay, argumentative research paper. So one thing that we want to talk about from the very beginning too is what is invention? Because a lot of people are going to hear invention and they're going to think that it's just brainstorming, just coming up with the topic, but it's more than that. It's the discovery and the development of ideas. It's the engine of argument, and it's taking us from, claims and statements that we've already heard to new ideas. You don't want to choose a topic and take a stance on it and present supporting evidence for it that's already out there 100 times over. You have to figure out a way to take it one step further, to show something new, show something different. So it's not just brainstorming, it's a series of intellectual moves that take you from this general topic to an actual argument. And invention allows you to come up with your own argument and support instead of just regurgitating what everybody else has already said. You want a unique perspective, and you use those sources to help back you up, here and there along the way, but you want the majority of your argument to be yours, right? So it gets us past those initial ideas that are already kind of out there and takes us beyond, right? So invention is so super important. See, we'll be talking about that. We're going to learn about different types of arguments, all of those different types of claims, fact, policy, and value. And we will be going over different invention strategies for each type of claim. Right? So when you start thinking about what kind of topic you want to use, and you won't have to do this until week 3, but that'll be here before you know it. You want an issue that's compelling, that people will be interested in, or at least a specific group of people would be interested in. They often originate from dramatic life situations, maybe not your own, but in general. So think about things like that. You know, they can be linked to things that have been around for ages, because sometimes issues go underground and then they resurface, right? Sometimes they're solved, but new ones emerge. So I'm not saying that you have to come up with a general topic that's completely out of the box, because issues are they stand the test of time, so many of them. And even things that have just come about over the last decade or two, like think about technology and social media for existence. For example, you can have an argument about social media, and that's new. It's a new issue because we didn't have social media back in the day. But still, what you're arguing, the heart of the issue, is something that I bet has been around forever. We're just arguing a new aspect of it, if you will. So those are the kind of issues that we want to search for. Ask yourself, what do I care about? What questions or problems am I drawn to, and why? And then when you think of those things, who else cares about it? What are their views? How do their views relate to my own? Where do people talk about this, right? Do we talk about it at home, in church, in school, at work? What point of view do I want to communicate, and how? What is my stance on this issue? What's my larger goal? What do I want to convey? Why do I want to convey this viewpoint? And what kind of effect do I want it to have on my audience? Who is my audience? And how do I want to affect their views, right? So if you start thinking about these questions, when you start trying to figure out a topic and move forward with your topic, it'll help you get where you need to be to really start working on the course project. Then the slides go into a couple of visual arguments, because we will be talking about visual arguments throughout the quarter. In fact, it's going to be a pretty significant chunk of what we do in the course. So I wanted to kind of introduce it here in this first PowerPoint. And the first one we have is this painting called Blessed Art Thou by Kate Kretz. And it's a bizarre painting. You've got Angelina Jolie and 3 of her children up in the heavens, looking, completely angelic and ephemeral, if you will. And then they're hovering above Walmart checkout lanes. Interesting. So the slide asks you to examine the image and then think about a few things. What is the issue? What's the issue that's being presented in the painting? How would you state the claim? If you had to put it in a sentence, the point of view that the artist was trying to communicate. If you put it in a sentence, what would it be? What reasons and evidence are given to support that position? And what makes the image interesting and effective as a visual argument? Visuals make arguments. There is definitely a point of view that is being communicated. There is an issue, an idea, an argument being presented in this painting. So, with no words on it, it does make it a little more difficult to decipher, but there are still plenty of things that we can notice about this visual. You can notice the stark contrast, the reality of the Walmart section, and then this imagined classical image of the heavens. We can notice that, clearly it's Angelina Jolie, one of the most worshipped celebrities, and her three of her children, and look how, it looks like a classical painting up there, like a Michelangelo, a Raphael, one of the other turtles. In this contrast, Think about who shops at Walmart. Think about what we encounter in checkout lanes, period. The fact that she's in the heavens. I mean, there's got to be something here about how we worship celebrities, right? Why are we in Walmart? I'm not entirely sure about that. The checkout lines I get, because what do we see in checkout lines? We see tabloids and magazines, right? And who's on the cover of them? Celebrities. So I think there's something to be said there. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth with this. I just wanted to put it on the slide and ask you those questions. It's just our first example of how argument comes in so many forms. And if you think that a simple picture or poster or painting isn't presenting an argument, then maybe this will start to get you thinking otherwise. Because you will see throughout the quarter that visual argument, we're going to work a lot with it. The next slide offers another example of visual argument. I think this one is a little more cut and dry. You've got the 1 in 5 women will be a victim of sexual assault during her college years. Stand up, speak up, stop sexual violence at Penn State. And it asks you the same 4 questions. You know, I think figuring out the issue here is a little easier. They kind of say it. You know, we should all be more aware, and we should all be more proactive and more helpful, because 1 in 5 women will become a victim of sexual assault during her college years, right? What reasons or evidence are given to support it? It's they're in the words, 1 in 5 women. We're using statistics, right? We're using data to help support this claim. What makes the image interesting and effective? I think the word cloud on top of the one figure. You know, you've got the 4 that are just black, but then the 1 in 5, it's not just that she's differentiated in a different color, but it's the word cloud. You, sister, daughter, friend, classmate. It personalizes it, right? So this one's a little easier because it has the words to go with it. So we're going to be looking at both types of visuals, where you have text to go with it and then without, right? So I hope I'm so excited about all the visual argument we're going to talk about. I hope you guys like it. But that's just visual argument. There's still written argument, which encompasses such a huge portion of academic argument, and even argument in our daily lives, because I think you could take speeches like oral arguments and debates, and I think you could categorize them with written argument, because they're certainly not visual, and we could transcribe it and then read it, right? So we're going to be engaging with written argument on a pretty regular basis throughout the quarter. In fact, the first week 1 assignment 1 is called engaging with written argument. So you'll get started on it pretty quickly. But to review, what is argument? Argument equals claim plus support. All different kinds. There's academic argument, traditional, consensual. We're going to look at the Pullman argument. But at their core, it's just about persuasion. Okay? And don't forget, we're surrounded by argument data. We're going to learn how to read argument, how to analyze it, how to invent it, because it's critical to our roles as students, as professionals, and as people who live in a world full of argument. Okay. If you have any questions about any of the material presented in the PowerPoint, let me know. Otherwise, you can move on to the next item.